Yes. So that means that like one, it's measured in 30. So if you look at the map, so when you're looking at the map, you'll notice that it will have like different between data. So it's measured at 30-minute intervals. So I believe that means that the contours differ within 30-minute intervals per day of hours of fog. So like it has a max of 14.5 hours of fog, and like the points are like 30-minute intervals. So it shows like the differences in contours, like from 1 to 2 to 3 are in wait.
All right, so
from
it's 5:40, so we're
1.5
getting
to 2
started.
are like
Thank you all
hours.
for coming. This is now our fourth SURG Research Symposium and our second in-person one. So really exciting for all our researchers and all of our community members here today. Before we get started, thank you. I want to do a quick land acknowledgement. At UC Berkeley, we sit on the territory of the Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the China-speaking Ohlone people, who are the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. And this land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone tribe and other familiar descendants of the Verona Band. Every member of the UC Berkeley community, as students, as researchers, as people who are just on this land, benefit and continue to benefit off this use and occupation since our university's founding in 1868. And we want to make sure that we acknowledge the relationship and the history of our relationship with the Native people on this land, and also acknowledging the fact that land acknowledgements by nature are performative, and making sure that we take time out of our day and out of our life to do a solid understanding and research of what it means to be on Native people's land. So yeah, with that, we'll get started with our symposium.
So what is SURG? SURG stands for the SDG Undergraduate Research Group. We were founded about 2 years ago, and it's guided by the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So all of our research is led by undergraduates around the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, which really allows for a lot of it to be broad, to be focused on the benefit of humans, which is fun. And so all of our projects are student-led, and a lot of them are guided by faculty, and they allow for students to take initiative and follow projects to their own heart's desire, which is really fun. And at the end, we collaborate on a research report and then present it for the community for a symposium, which is posted to YouTube for anyone to watch afterwards. Cool, thank you. Next slide.
So here are a couple of SURG's goals. Number 1, to research cross-cutting sustainability issues in relation to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We also want to empower undergraduate voices by increasing access to research on campus. Our researchers join working groups to research sustainability topics, contribute to a collaborative research report, and present findings to key stakeholders at our semester symposiums.
So currently SURG has over 25 student researchers. So by having all of you here, we're increasing undergraduate leadership within research. We have 4 distinct research committees, which we'll all be presenting today, and they're committed to taking action inspired by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals through their research. And yeah, so we're guided by the 17 SDGs, and through them, we expand our understanding of sustainability with this interdisciplinary framework in mind.
Cool. Let's get started.
Presenting our first research group, which is urban agriculture in East Bay, led by Ava.
Do you want more?
Just a reminder, watch yourself in the see, make sure you're in frame.
Oh yeah. All right, we might have to switch it around, but yeah, hello everybody. Welcome to tonight's symposium. We're so happy that all of you could join us today. So we're just going to introduce our project, which is urban agriculture in the East Bay. Before we get started, we're going to introduce ourselves. My name is Ava, and I'm the committee lead for this project. I'm a third year studying ecosystem management and forestry with minors in GIS and food systems.
I'm Alyssa. I'm a third year urban studies and society and environment major with a minor in sustainable design. Hi, I'm Joyce. I'm a second year molecular environmental biology major. Recording in progress. Minor in data science.
Hi, I'm Annika. I'm a first year environmental engineering major.
Hi, I'm Quentin. I'm a third year urban studies major.
My name is Kavina. I'm a first year environmental economics and policy. So we want to start off with a quick land acknowledgement. The urban agriculture team at SURG recognizes and understands that UC Berkeley is situated on the Cretan territory, the ancestral and stolen land of the Chichenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. We realize that every UC Berkeley student, staff, and faculty member continues to reap benefits from the occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. This region is of continuous importance to the Northma Ohlone tribe and familial descendants of the Verona Band. Consistent with SURG's commitment to using research to advance the UN Sustainable Development Goals and foster a more sustainable and equitable society, we as students hold the responsibility to acknowledge and make evident the university's relationship with Indigenous communities.
Awesome. So yeah, we're just going to give you a quick overview of our project today. Originally, it was just going to be a semester-long project, but we've decided to extend into the fall. So today is sort of like our halfway checkpoint. And yeah, just going to dive into it. Yeah, so why this project? Essentially, our food systems on the local and global scale are in crisis. They're characterized by socio-ecological commodification, extraction, and exploitation of land and people. And so most of the food that we put inside of our bodies actually comes from monocultures that depend directly on a slew of agrochemicals that are not only detrimental to environmental health, but also human health. And this approach to agriculture has really led to extensive land degradation over the past couple of decades and has caused a lot of biodiversity decline as well. And not to mention, it's a major driver of climate change, responsible for 30% of annual emissions. This ecological destruction ties in directly to the fact that our industrial food system is not designed to support eaters, farmers, or land, but is directly built to consolidate capital and land in the hands of a few agricultural corporations. And so despite, this kind of system that we've seen unfold over the past couple of decades has allowed us to significantly increase our food production, but 40% of it ultimately goes to waste, and we have rampant food insecurity climbing every single year, with 50 million Americans and 1 in 5 Californians facing food insecurity. And we know that this is kind of directly correlated to race and class, as these rates are felt disproportionately among these communities, and especially in Alameda County, food insecurity rates are 20% higher in red line neighborhoods as opposed to green line ones. So a lot of our focus on this project is uncovering this history and kind of contextualizing why we see such high food insecurity rates. And we see that urban agriculture can really be a powerful tool to kind of help repair our relationships to the land that we are all on right now. And over the past couple months, we've all been working all together on this. We started with a literature review that focused on a variety of different sources. And then we focused on data collection, mostly through GIS sources. We looked at current urban ag sites, as well as the development for new sites and historical data that we used for our mapping project that we're going to show you in a second. And then what else did we do? We synthesized our findings from our lit review and integrated them into an ArcGIS story maps project, which we will hopefully get a chance to show you if we have time. But yeah, ArcGIS story maps is just a really neat opportunity to kind of still show scientifically backed findings, but it makes for a more integrated and kind of accessible experience for users.
So our project aims to address the following sustainable development goals, which are defined as zero hunger, which aims to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture.
good health and well-being, which aims to ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Reduced inequalities, which aims to reduce inequality within among countries, specifically our own communities. And climate action, which urges us to take action to combat climate change and its impacts.
So now we'll move on to defining what urban agriculture really is. So in a nutshell, urban agriculture refers to the cultivation, processing, and distribution of agricultural products in urban and suburban settings. And the UCANR defines urban agriculture as also including production, distribution, and marketing of food, and innovative food production methods that maximize production in a smaller area. The American Planning Association goes on to elaborate that urban agriculture addresses issues central to community food security, development, neighborhood development, environmental sustainability, and other concerns. And there exists a rich history of urban agriculture across the East Bay in California, which is our site of focus. And throughout this project, we do aim to contextualize the necessity for urban agriculture by making connections to historic racist and classist policies to present day health and food access barriers among marginalized communities. And despite all these obstacles, it is undeniable that over the past several years, urban agriculture has been gaining momentum in our cities in California, such as San Francisco and Berkeley. And here's just a picture of the Black Panther Party organizing pre-grocery giveaways in Berkeley, and we'll talk more about that in our plant history. So there's many different forms of urban agriculture, and we also tend to have different goals in different projects. Some focus on the revitalization of historically marginalized cultures, and some promote urban agroecology, and some tackle food security brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's also farms that help refugees nourish themselves with culturally significant foods, such as in the International Rescue Communities Needs Program, based in Sacramento. They help refugees farm foods, farming ingredients that are used in traditional Afghan Iraqi foods. And there's also like different forms such as school gardens, rooftop gardens, and vertical farms and community gardens. So the modes of these projects that can occur. And some examples are the Berkeley basket, the West Berkeley Garden, and the Oaktown Farms that are into campus vertical farming. And there's also the Merritt College Land Fort Nursery that has many horticulture programs for students interested in getting involved in urban agriculture. So all in all the urban agriculture sites that we mentioned all play a role in increasing access to nutritious, sustainably produced food. But our report will primarily focus on the significance of those with the goals of uplifting community food sovereignty and reclaiming land for the community good.
So a big part of my work this semester was mapping the overlapping and pretty complex histories of the land in the East Bay to better understand the current geographies of urban agriculture and food sovereignty. So I'm going to be taking you through some of the stories that have shaped the landscape that we see today. The Least John Maloney people have lived on this land for thousands of years, and despite colonization, continue to live here today. The structures of settler colonialism and capitalism that have shaped this landscape are interwoven with stories of community care, activism, and survival. And so by mapping these stories, we hope to highlight ways to decolonize this land and work towards a restorative revolution. So in 1776, the Spanish colonized the Bay Area. They established the Presidio, the mission, and two missions at Mission Dolores and Mission San Jose. Colonists forced the Ohlone off of their land into the missions, which were essentially plantation systems based on slave labor and cultural genocide. This colonization and institution of settler relationships between people and place laid the groundwork for extraction, industry, and socio-ecological exploitation that exists today. In 1851, after California's annexation, 119 tribes across California surrendered the vast majority of their land to this to United States government under threat of violence. The Senate provided no legal recognition for the indigenous people, indigenous tribes, and no protection either. Meanwhile, the UC was established with 150,000 acres of stolen land. You can see UC Berkeley there,
and the UC continues to be the largest landowner in California. In 1869, the arrival of the Central Pacific Railroad in Oakland ushered in an era of rapid industrialization, which was made possible by the development of coastal estuaries and baylands using landfill. So land that was used to be baylands is now like fully developed land. You can see that in gray. Industry and laborers flocked to Oakland, particularly during World War II, concentrated around industry in West Oakland and North Richmond. The industrial sites are in orange. Okay. So this era of rapid industrialization and demographic change coincided with redlining in the East Bay, which enforced racial segregation and structured class hierarchy along racial and geographic lines. The Federal Housing Authority released residential security maps, which designated areas, quote unquote, infiltrated by undesirable populations as not eligible for loans or for investment. And so as wartime industry disappeared, Black and brown communities were essentially trapped in declining areas with no spatial or economic mobility. Simultaneous with this disinvestment was the inception of the Black Panther Party, which is credited with the beginnings of the food justice movement in the East Bay. So 2 of their key food distribution sites are highlighted in purple. In response to widespread food insecurity among youth, particularly in the most underserved communities, the Panthers started the Free Breakfast for Children program, which was the precedent for a lot of modern food justice efforts in the East Bay today. And now looking at where we are today, here there are some like the overlapping history of redlining is overlaid with areas of currently low food access. So if there's not a grocery store within half a mile, that's shaded in purple. And additionally with current urban agriculture projects, which are the little black dots. So we can see the history is playing out today in the geographic, social, and economic barriers to accessing healthy, affordable, and culturally relevant foods. There's a lot of overlap between redlined areas and areas with low food access. But however, there are also numerous urban agriculture projects working to reestablish a local sustainable food system. Go to the next slide. And finally, we want to look forward at the potential to reclaim disused public lands for building this local food system for local food sovereignty and environmental well-being. And so here in green are parcels identified by Nathan McClintock's work as public lands with potential for food production. And just to conclude, we think that particularly focus should be put on local food systems and local food access in historically redlined communities and areas that lack access. And additionally, to truly build food sovereignty for this community, this work has to be done within the context of decolonization and land rematriation. A lot of that work has been started by the Suburban Land Trust, and moving forward, we think that identifying these parcels is a first step in building potential for agroecology in East Bay to mend some of the relationships between people and place.
So now we wanted to go into the importance of food sovereignty and education in urban agriculture initiatives. So here's some definitions that are very useful if we talk about a little bit food justice especially, but we kind of wanted to highlight that establishing food sovereignty through urban agriculture allows communities to reduce their reliance on big ag and eliminate the need for chemical agriculture. And then we're talking about those organizations that work towards food sovereignty. There are many that historically have little, however, often on mobile and Oakland empowers you to learn and engage in farming. And with that means farm cities like Oakland and Food Justice have these vibrant spaces that the community can really engage in and to learn about how to take control of their food systems. And then talking about identity-based gardens, these are important because they provide the culturally relevant foods and medicines, as well as spaces for those communities to engage. So we have something like the Deep Medicine Circle in Oakland, which is a women of color-led organization looking to uplift indigenous voices and repair those connections to the lands that have been destroyed by floods. So some affinity gardens that are associated with the Berkeley student farms here in Berkeley are the Lamama Rooftop Garden with the Hispanic Engineers and Scientists Organization, the federally funded Black Resource Center, and the Indigenous Human Garden, and both of which are in Oxford. So the importance of education, of course, some of these things that we talked about after the Redwood Deep Medicine Circle have this importance of allowing people to learn about their food systems as well as Indigenous stewardship, and as we talked about land use history. And of course, these situations of working on the land and helping people work on the land aids the mental health of an entire community.
Next, we have sustainability and climate. In an age of rapid urbanization and globalization, cities contribute approximately 75% of greenhouse gas emissions. Reincorporating sustainable agriculture and green spaces into our urban centers has powerful implications for the climate crisis. We have narrowed our focus to the following 3 points, which are food miles, urban heat islands, and access to green space. First, food miles, which is defined as the distance traveled for food to reach its destination or from production to consumer. The consequences this has is that food in our current system must travel long distances to reach its destination, resulting in the average meal in the United States averaging 1,500 miles from farm to plate, which is equivalent to 10 calories of fossil fuel energy into our food system for every calorie of food, which is clearly not a sustainable way of distributing food. Why urban agriculture? Urban agriculture has the means to reduce the carbon footprint and the associated costs with transport, particularly air travel, which has a much greater exhaust than land transportation. In addition to promoting cool cities, urban ag also serves as a sink for urban waste and carbon dioxide. Next, we have urban heat islands. So the urban heat islands are regions or areas that experience elevated temperatures due to the high concentrations of surfaces that retain heat, such as pavement and buildings, also known as cities. This effect can increase the temperatures of metropolitan areas anywhere from 1 to 6 degrees Celsius or 1.8 to 10.8 degrees Fahrenheit. As well, this results in higher air pollution levels and impacts on aquatic life. Urban agriculture. In the Bay Area, a study by Merritt Friedman published in 2015 found that urban vegetation could be effective in mitigating the UHI effect, particularly in summer when temperatures are highest here in the East Bay. Next, we have access to green space. The planning and design of urban areas throughout the United States have had a significant impact on equity surrounding green spaces and their benefits. And emerging studies have found that at a national level, communities with higher Latinx and African American populations have more limited access to green spaces. We can see that in red line communities were the hottest neighborhoods in 94% of cities, and Black individuals are 52% more likely to live in areas with higher heat risk. This plays out here. We can see a map of New York City, which illustrates the overlap between historically red line neighborhoods, which you can see here, and areas lacking green space, which you can see over here. Those are the lighter areas. Next, in the Bay Area, in Oakland, neighborhoods of color have access to 26% less park space per person than the city median and 69% less than those in white neighborhoods.
So urban agriculture also integrates the applications of agroecological principles into urban farming, where agroecology is defined as the use of ecological principles to the study, design, and management of agroecosystems that are both productive and natural resource conserving, culturally sensitive, socially just, and economically viable. So some examples of agroecological practices that the UC Track implements are no-till, which preserves soil structure and protects helpful microorganisms; crop cover, which minimizes resource loss and erosion, maintains moisture and attracts beneficial insects; and intercropping, which uses different species in the same area to maintain healthy soils. And this is important because it promotes practices that are regenerative and environmentally sustainable while combating environmental pollution and pest. And so next we're going to talk about the challenges and barriers to urban agriculture. So first, economics is a challenge in the East Bay. where thriving urban farms are struggling to maintain operations as it's difficult to create monetary value out of social enterprises. High prices for operating a farm in an urban area makes it difficult to sustain and often requires general support from the national, state, or local level. Another issue is revenue. Urban farms report needing multiple sources of revenue to remain vital, that are vital for its operations, such as grants, fundraising, and unsolicited donations. And lastly, labor is difficult to source. And in the East Bay, urban agriculture is mostly made up of volunteers rather than paid workers. And while there's a desire to hire paid workers, nonprofit farms have difficulty finding access to capital and grant.
Another huge issue is the ability to get land tenure. Adequate land tenure is something that's very difficult for the disadvantaged communities that actually benefit most from urban agriculture to get. One of these issues is owning a single family home. We know that usually owning a single family home is the best way to start gardening, but usually home ownership in the US has a history of discrimination, especially against Black and brown folk. And today, white middle class families hold a much higher rate of home ownership than any other place. This kind of feeds into the stereotype that urban agriculture and gardening in general is only for rich white folks, which is not true. The high price of land in the Bay Area also exacerbates this in our area as well. And then if the urban ag initiative was to try to begin on common land or land from a private owner, there's this sense of impermanence because often the local government or the private owner sees urban agriculture as commercially useless or environmental and gives little protection from development. So here we see this is a flyer to give negotiation skills and kind of allow for women-led urban agriculture initiatives to learn about the policies in their area that help them and land tenure grants that they can get. And here we see the Oxford Tract has had difficulties in the past because they currently are operating on UC Berkeley land, and that is a very tenuous relationship and can be frustrating for the organizers because it is often a threat of development. So here we can see that new student housing is taking over a large part of the space that says research and instructional fields, which is mostly the Oxford Tract and the Berkeley student farms.
And then lastly, zoning and policy is another issue with urban agriculture, as the political economy does not fully compensate farmers for the social and ecological services that their farms provide. Policies vary in support throughout the East Bay. There was previous policy intended to eradicate limitations to providing urban agriculture access to more communities, but it unfortunately fell short. It was known as Urban Agriculture Incentive Zones Act, or AB 551. It was intended to reverse limitations and barriers to entry for urban agriculture, but it ultimately failed to help low-income communities and people who would most benefit from the cultivation of urban agriculture. And the key takeaways are that while policymakers try to create mechanisms to aid people in need, what they believe in is not always what's needed. And community engagement and involvement is key for on-the-ground processes that are beneficial for everyone, which is why Nathan McClintock's work is so important because it focuses on alternative ownership of land, such as public and community land, to provide food security to those in need.
Awesome. So yeah, I don't think we have time to show you the final story maps, which is unfortunate, but you can find the slides after, and we encourage you to take a look around just to see how it all turned out. I think it'll probably be linked on the SURG website as well. So you can find it there and explore on your own time. So yeah, looking ahead, like we mentioned, we're going to be working into the fall. So that's going to be primarily based around a working collaboration with Rob Benetton, who is the Bay Area Urban Agriculture Advisor for the UC-A&R office. And we recently met with him a couple of weeks ago to discuss the mapping that we're doing, which was especially focused on identifying current urban ag sites. And he's been working on a several-year-long project called the Neighborhood Food Mapping Project, essentially doing what we were trying to do, creating the data set of all the urban ag sites and the details of what they're actually trying to accomplish. There are over 300 sites, which we definitely did not get to capture in our data set in just one semester. So that's going to be wrapped up, I think, in the next couple of months. So we're going to integrate that data into our maps as well. Additionally, we mentioned what we're doing with the historical mapping, and he really liked that project. So he pointed us in the direction of some additional resources that we can include in that as well. So lots of focus on just updating the mapping, making it more robust. And additionally, we really want to focus on the ground engagement with groups. That's not something we got the chance to do this semester due to timing issues and stuff. But I think that's a really important part of this is not just doing this like research on the outside, but actually getting on the ground and connecting with the leaders who are doing this work. So we want to just hear their stories and see what we can learn from them and if we have anything to offer in terms of our research skills. So I'm going to be really prioritizing that. And then perhaps most excitingly, the final story maps that we complete next fall, it's going to be uploaded to the UC A&R website as a living resource for the urban ag community. So we'll be able to reach a wider scope of people, which we're really excited about. Yeah. I just want to say thank you to my wonderful research team for all the hard work they put into this. But yeah, that is everything for today. So we can take any questions if there is time, which I don't know if there is, but yeah, thank you.
One or two questions.
Yeah.
I saw earlier there was like multiple colors of redlining. Would you mind explaining it?
Yeah, sure. The colors are like green being the best quality, blue being like pretty good, orange being not so great, and red being like quote unquote like undesirable, like the worst quality. And that is basically how like loans and outside investment was like distributed. So if you lived in an area that was like quote unquote redlined, like the bank wouldn't give you a loan, it would be like not so much outside investment into the bank.
How did you get the low grocery store access data?
That was from an existing data set put together from a project about food apartheid and gentrification in Oakland.
I think it originally relied upon the USDA food desert data. So we were actually trying to work on that ourselves, but there's an issue where you actually have to join the shape file to like a CSV, like Excel file. And we could not get that to work for some reason, but luckily somebody had done that. Someone had done it. Yeah. So that's the beauty of ArcGIS Online. I think is it's a very collaborative platform that you can, have easier access to data. So yeah, any other questions? Those two, but we have time.
Oh, I didn't-
Hello, my name is Isabel.
My name's Savannah.
Unfortunately, the rest of our co-researchers are all having COVID right now, so we'll just be us presenting today. Yeah, so we wanted to research housing in the area, and these are two main research questions that guided our research. The first being how does interim accessory / transitional housing impact the environment, community, and the housing population it creates itself. And then the second one, how do we work to not only help the housing population find a steady living space, but help maintain that space properly.
So the relevant SDGs that for our project were no poverty, reduced inequalities, and sustainable cities and communities.
And then here are some definitions of what places that we came across in our research. The main one being temporary or transitional housing, which basically just means structures built to be temporarily on site or permanent buildings that are used for like temporary stays. Houselessness, the absence of secure housing, and then permanent housing as defined by the California government is this community-based housing without a designated length of stay, where formerly housed individuals and families live independently. And then affordable housing is basically deemed on the school level usually by like the rated by usually municipal government according to a housing affordability index.
And then supportive housing is a combination of affordable housing and supportive social services for people experiencing homelessness. And then the low income requirements, which are often will determine who gets affordable housing, is defined as a percentage area median income in accordance with the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee.
Okay, and then some background and context to why we wanted to research this. In the past couple of years, homelessness has increased in the Bay Area due to a lot of factors like increases in rent, like stagnant wages, inflation, and obviously COVID-19. And then also as Berkeley students who wanted to provide like a consumer home conceptual background, which is obviously UC Berkeley's plan to develop people's park. So we did want to include that. So that does, or that is planned to have 18 months of like transitional housing for houseless individuals. Yes, and then temporary housing, just to kind of read over that, since that's the basis of our research. And basically, a lot of these programs vary from city to city, but like funding and grants determine exactly what goes on in the transitional housing program. It's not a long-term solution for permanent housing, and it usually allows people to remain there for 2 years, but in most cases, a lot shorter than that. And it's basically to bridge the gap between homelessness and the other permanent housing solution.
Now we're going to get into some case studies which represent some solution-based approaches for the homeless community or for the homelessness in the East Bay. So Abode Services was founded in Alameda County in 1989, and it first addressed just the Tri-City area of the Bay. So it was Fremont, New York, and then Union City. And then they have grown into a regional agency with housing developments in Alameda and a lot of other cities in the Bay Area. And it offers affordable housing and supporting social services to people experiencing homelessness. And they operate 60 primary programs and partner with 40 local service providers to connect residents to social services. So the application process for Abode Services is pretty extensive. It includes a 6-page application that requires rental history, housing references, criminal background, income information, asset information, and credit history. And then after submitting that application, next step is like 1 to 2 interviews, which more documentation is required. And there's also a housing first approach that is offered, where in offering housing, they believe that homeless persons should get housing first without having to go through any of these behavioral steps or application processes. And so the housing developments that they have, a lot of them are converted existing structures that were converted into housing units. So some examples are the Cedar Community Apartments, which originated from a hotel. And then another example is the City Center Apartment projects in Fremont, which were converted old parking garages. So maintenance, there have been a lot of accounts that we have found of residents in San Jose. It's not just limited to San Jose and Fremont, but all over the Bay, which complain about security issues and delayed maintenance and services that were promised. So an example is Abode Services promised on-site medical, mental health services and job training, but the services were not provided. So a quote from Daisy Elon is, "From my experience of living in as a tenant through this program, both apartments were broken into. A lot of my belongings were either tampered with and some objects swapped out for rags. It also feels like you're being monitored 24/7. It's a disgusting program." So this is a very simplified conclusion, but 12% of those who apply for both housing get accepted, which means like a very selective application process. And 86 participants were, so of the 12% who get accepted, 86 of the participants were successfully rehoused into permanent housing. And there's a large inconsistency with the social services that are provided by this service. So another case study is the Sea Breeze encampment, which was an encampment where 50 to 60 people lived at the Sea Breeze homeless encampment, and it was located at the intersection of College Avenue and Interstate 80, near the Berkeley Marina. And then in early July 2021, which was last summer, the Sea Breeze camp was scheduled to be dismantled by Caltrans due to the growing issues with trash and fires. Berkeley city staff also cited problems like crime and domestic disputes. And so of the 60 residents, 26 residents were given services. 24 moved into hotel rooms through Project Turnkey. 2 people were accepted for person tent. And then the unhoused residents that were part of this encampment, so 17 of those relocated to city sidewalks or a nearby freeway exit, and then the remaining was left unknown.
And then lastly, we wanted to focus on the project, which is one of the only mixed studies on, or random controlled studies on approaches to serving most chronically houseless individuals in the Bay Area. So really interesting. And basically what they found is that 86% of the participants who were randomly like assigned to the permanent supportive housing were successfully housed and remained in the housing for many years after. But it did take about 10 weeks on average to find the housing, and 70% of the 159 participants had to go through that process multiple times before finding like a permanent placement. But again, widely considered a successful study because on average, participants remained housed for 93% of the time that they were like in the study. And I think the study really emphasized the success is based on the supplementive like supportive social services and also the need of like intervention early on. Unfortunately, a lot of participants died during the study because of them being a chronically houseless population. They had already been suffering with a lot of like chronic illnesses, and the success of the study had a lot to do with like intervening early on, and that would have like increased the success of the study. And then just generally from all of the different studies of course that we went through, these were kind of the things that individuals who have experienced these programs have said. So we can cover some advantages and disadvantages. Obviously, one of the main advantages is immediate shelter and food. Most of the programs do have some sort of financial or legal resources. And then obviously the kind of like support system. And then the disadvantages primarily were about a lack of privacy and the strict rules or regulations and like a lack of freedom. A lot of them think about having curfews. If you're not there by a certain time, you're locked out and don't have a stay. Things like not having pets or not being able to have like alcohol or people over. And then just generally the power dynamics of the housing. So a lot of complaints about staff threatening participants for not following the rules. And then generally also a lack of mental health and social services. And then again, obviously it's not permanent. And then kind of defined or like categorized into 3 main things. A lot of the individuals' time is spent on organizing, just being able to like live in these shelters. So they obviously don't have a lot of time to do outside things like other jobs. And then the 2 other things is it really doesn't allow for like a community to be established. So personal networks and friendships are usually very fragile and shortened because they're moving from place to place. So
most of the time, these transitional housings only last for a couple of months, maybe a year. And then obligations towards other people must be respected, and leaving the shelter may be seen as like abandoning these obligations. So it is hard to transition from place to place. Yeah, so just in general, we found that the implementation of the transitional temporary housing is extremely hectic, exhaustive, and consuming. They usually have to transfer from place to place, and so a lot of times they rent that out. And it's difficult to have like external others define permanent housing while you're trying to just secure temporary housing. And then yeah, and then also that's just becoming increasingly inaccessible because of increased rent prices and like little support to actually find permanent housing. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so basically these are our kind of general conclusions from the series. So a lot of the times housing or temporary transitional housing doesn't have social services for mental health or disabilities. So it's not the same as treatment. Housing, temporary housing doesn't alleviate grief, health illnesses, drug addiction, unemployment, or like social isolation.
And then nonprofit organizations support residents by supplying tents, clothes, and food, or driving an injured person to the emergency room. Berkeley advocates where we go to Berkeley.
Yeah, and then temporary housing has not been shown to be effective in ending homelessness on a community level because it basically doesn't allow for a community approach and is focused on individuals. And so one of our conclusions is the need for permanent supportive housing, which is like under California and evidence-based housing intervention that combines ongoing rental assistance with actual supportive services such as health and mental health care to find for homeless individuals, and that is kind of what the Santa study did and what they were successful in. Thank you.
Great job, guys. So feel free to take any questions just in time. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. We are the Redwood Restoration and Indigenous Management Study Team, and we are also continuing into the fall 2022 semester. So this is our progress report and key milestone summary. We can do a quick introduction.
Yeah, I'm Isabel.
I'm Luna. I'm Emma. Bia. Emma. And Belle is joining us virtually. Just for a quick introduction to the topic, coastal redwoods, and that's the scientific name right there, are well known for being the tallest living species on Earth and are very fundamentally important to their ecosystems. They're also like a very well-known species, and they're really, really important for biodiversity and other things, including supporting vulnerable wildlife, helping prevent soil runoff, filtering water in rivers and streams, and also storing carbons. Redwood forests also store more carbon than any other forest ecosystem, so it's really, really important in mitigating climate change. There are also impacts of stressors impacting the existence of redwoods, including severe wildfires, climate change, land use practices like logging. It's kind of like a double-edged sword in terms of climate change impacting the wildfires, and then also as they're being degraded, that carbon is going back into the atmosphere, and so it's a cycle. And this is a picture of some redwood trees in Woods, California. Project Growth. Our project began in January with the broad intention of looking at redwood restoration in the Bay Area. And in February, we applied to and were awarded a $2,000 grant from the Save the Redwoods League in order to help us do our research.
And it's taking a few phases, including just exploring and doing an initial literature review, making maps and learning the GIS process and deciding which processes we wanted to work on, planning out the field work, and finalizing our research and putting it into academic writing, which will take place in the fall semester. We also really wanted to incorporate Indigenous management and sovereignty as a method of climate justice and redwood forest management. An example that we saw in late January, and some of you might have seen in the news, was the same group, the Save the Redwoods League, actually gave over 500 acres of land in Northern California back to some Indigenous tribes, the Intertribal Sinkyone Wilderness Council. So we thought that was really, really cool, and we wanted to really use that lens in our forest management, especially since the history of forest management in California has been really ignorant of traditional ecological knowledge.
Yeah, so we focused on 3 sustainable development goals in our research. So first one is goal 10, reduced inequality. So it's really important to consider historical land management practices in order to reduce future inequalities. And then goal 13 is climate action. So taking urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. And then last goal 15 is life on land. So this one is to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably managed forests, prevent desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss.
Yeah, so this is kind of getting into our GIS and biological processes, which we're going to talk about for a little bit. So kind of the basis of that is related to our methodology, which is broken down into 3 separate parts: research, mapping, and fieldwork. So our research, the systems that we used for that was Zotero. We have 67 pieces of kind of like PDF files, database information, as well as like literature review that's located in that Zotero. So we use that because it's open to the public, free to use, and we were able to create that group where we're able to share all these files together with one another. That kind of led us into our mapping as well as part of the basis for the information that we wanted to look at. So with mapping, we used ArcGIS Pro as well as some more basic introductory stuff into MapSense, which we're going to get into more later. But with ArcGIS Pro, we use data from the USGS, the United States Geological Survey, as well as the National Park Service. So that information is free to the public, and they have a lot of varying databases and levels of kind of metadata that we were able to use in our mapping projects in order to show kind of redwoods and where they're occurring in Point Reyes, where we decided to take our study. And then with that data, we're kind of making sure that we're able to clip it the way that we wanted and kind of like configuring it so that we're able to show correctly how we want to display this data so that we're best able to show the results, as well as hopefully create predictive distribution maps through MapSense. And then fieldwork, the last portion here, is what we're going to be getting into next semester. So we've just been looking at different things that we're able to study and we were able to take that from there.
Okay, so this first graph here is, like Bia said, it's made with data that was pulled from the National Park Service, and it represents the redwood occurrences within the Point Reyes National Seashore. And we're not too far from that, so nice and local. And we thought that considerations of occurrences of these redwoods would be important, not only because you have to know where the redwoods are to be able to manage them, but because it also kind of reveals information about their density within this area. And stand density is a pretty major consideration of different management techniques, particularly tree thinning. And what tree thinning is, it's a strategy that removes specific trees in a way that promotes old forest growth, which is an ecologically favorable kind of forest growth because it will have trees that are more stable. They're old and they've been there for a long time, so they're more able to cater to their environment and the different species that rely on them. And we do have, in our literature search, we found some studies that kind of corroborate these things that we were talking about. So in one particular study, thinning trees down to old forest growth densities, which are around 125 trees per hectare, it helps increase the width of tree stems by 128%, which is a pretty significant amount. And it also increased the proportion of redwood trees within that area. So just to say all this in a more simplified terms, that would kind of be looking at redwood occurrences can be helpful for figuring out areas for managing this particular redwood population. And another thing we looked at was kind of the conditions that these redwoods are experiencing currently. More particularly, we were looking at the fog belts that's coming off of the coast in this region. And fog is a pretty important environmental condition for redwoods because it actually represents a very high amount. So 20% of the redwood water demand, which becomes especially significant during the summer when there's not a lot of precipitation here in California. So, and also it can help distribute nitrogen through the ecosystem. So some other studies we're looking at showed that trees that are near areas with lots of fog have more nitrogen in their leaves, which is important because nitrogen is often a limiting factor in how much plants and redwoods are able to grow. So that could be important, we thought, in helping direct where reforestation efforts could succeed and where we could put redwoods that we know could have a higher chance of doing well because they have these resources.
Yeah, and so for the next map, I'm still focusing on the same areas, so point areas, and then using the ArcGIS data. So we're focusing now on redwoods and surrounding vegetation. So redwoods are really important to their own ecosystems because they kind of help the understory, like vegetation, and like thrive. So these are all vegetation that is kind of reliant on the presence of redwoods. And so fog is also definitely an important factor still, because these plants also do rely on the fog for a lot of their precipitation needs. And so a lot of these species are biological indicators of the health of redwood ecosystems. We can kind of use them as a gauge to see how the ecosystem health is doing and use that in our future conservation methods. And so one species that we looked at in particular called Western Trillium, or also known more commonly as like a white lily, is one of the species that rely on redwoods. And so in a study that we looked at, we found that they were pretty sensitive to the redwood logging. So in areas that the redwoods were logged, like these plant population, their abundance like decreased. And so we can see that there is a correlation between the two factors. And so for this map, we just like kind of narrowed it down a little more specifically to a few of the undergrowth plant populations. So we looked at stone oaks, evergreen huckleberry, Douglas firs, and then the California bay. So you can see that there is a strong correlation between the presence of these plant populations and the redwood growth.
So our view with the semester was postponed, but hopefully that will give us the chance to further develop our method and figure out how to integrate some of our data collection with the GIS analysis we've been working on. But in the next few months, we plan to stay at the Point Reyes field station and do some data collection in the surrounding area. And we're thinking of mostly collecting qualitative information, things like tree health and other data that would sort of relate to the GIS mappers that we have, along with things like stand density, DBH, which is diameter at breast height, which can be indicative of tree height and tree age, and then other things like bark thickness, images, and observations of things like fog and soil quality.
Next is some of our research on traditional ecological knowledge and the colonial history of method. So what is TK? TK stands for traditional ecological knowledge and is defined as the system of knowledge that recognizes the knowledge that indigenous peoples have learned over generations of contact with their land. And this knowledge is constantly evolving. It's not something static. That's why it can also be called tribal ecological knowledge to reflect that. And this is a system of knowledge that Western scientific knowledge has historically ignored or even invalidated at some times. But it's a very valid system of knowledge. It's just been built up over generations and generations of knowledge and stories. And simply like our institutional Western science hasn't had the time to like validate all of this complex knowledge that tribes have built with their ecosystems. And this system of knowledge is really important for conservation of redwoods because it represents a different worldview that can see ecosystems more holistically and less in like a resource-oriented approach that conventional conservation has. So that's why using both systems of knowledge, both traditional ecological knowledge and Western scientific knowledge is really important because they can integrate to better understand an ecosystem. And we're using this in our research. We are looking at different methods of forest management and how TK has been integrated and how it can be greater integrated into forest management, and also how forest management can be used to increase indigenous sovereignty.
So I'll be talking about the colonial history of mapping and GIS. I want to start off by saying that maps are extremely flawed and more often than not exclude cultures, landscapes, and people. Throughout the course of history, European explorers often left out areas that Indigenous people occupied during their explorations. An example of this is James Meehan, who was a cartographer in the early 1800s. He explored Tasmania, which is a small island in Australia. And like many early cartographers, he was sent out on this expedition by his colonial government with the goals of expanding their empire and creating new settlements. In this case, the colonial government was Great Britain. And in his map titled The Plan of Settlement at the River Darwen, which is pictured below, Meehan made sure to note the areas where European agriculture would be able to flourish. And in his other maps, he left blank spaces or used the term unexplored land in order to catch the attention of those viewing his map and to make them believe that there were riches in that specific area. And so Meehan's goal ultimately was to portray the island as an empty, uninhabited piece of land, rich with natural resources and economic opportunities awaiting for European settlement. And so the solution to this should be to deconstruct these structures of power that exist even today, and to create maps that are inclusive to communities and people that are so often overlooked and marginalized. If these issues are not addressed, then the digital maps we use today are nothing but a colonial facade.
And for next steps, these have been briefly mentioned throughout the presentation, but we are going to be continuing into next semester. And we have a couple of deliverables, one of which will be sending this video recording of the presentation to the Saving Redwoods League. Additionally, a final written report summarizing the project, and also a scientific research paper with some of the graphs that we've already shown you, and a couple more that we might be going into. And then just to leave you guys with some key takeaways. Overall, we had the results of our year-long effort, which I just mentioned. And we also want to share this presentation with the Save the Redwoods League. And like Emma mentioned also, we have some field work coming up next semester as well.
Kind of getting into the more technical aspects of it, it's been a lot of learning how to use GIS and starting to work with MapScent. Definitely learning how to read those scientific literature papers and really pull all the relevant information to our research out of a lot of these different papers. Being able to begin analyzing the patterns related to redwood growth and how that pertains to our research, as well as planning and executing field research that we're going to next semester.
For our TK applications next semester, we want to look into building relationships with Indigenous groups. So we're not just going in and extracting knowledge. We really want to hear from them how our research can be most valuable. And we have also acknowledged the colonial history of GIS and mapping and want to incorporate Indigenous management into our solutions.
So with that, we just have a couple of acknowledgements. I want to thank my team for all of their work. We also got some academic advice from Matthew Potts, Robert Rue, Elizabeth Cameron, and a couple other folks. And we also want to give, of course, a special thanks to Barsha, Rohit, and Chris Stoll. Yeah, and with that, we can take any questions that you guys have. Thank you so much for listening.
Question, I don't know if it's on point, but I just kept thinking about global warming. and when you're talking about the fog and the redwoods, and did you go into any of that in your research and impact and future?
Yeah, so I guess along the lines of like data related to that, we've started looking at like world climate data sets that are related to like average temperature in these different areas. So we're going to start overlaying that on top of a lot of redwood data that we have, and looking into like climate data as well as like soil data, potentially like distance from streams, and creating a lot of different like much more maps than we currently have on like the data related to that, to create kind of a predictive distribution map of where it would be best to plant redwoods and like extend their growth for the future. Thank you.
Hi everyone, we are the Consumer Culture and Climate Change Committee. We are a continuing SURG project from last semester, and we'll be continuing next semester as well. So a little bit of our project, when we first started off this project last semester, we want to analyze the relationship between overconsumption and current climate change solutions. So last semester, we focused a lot about trying to understand what are the key drivers to overconsumption and how are current climate change solutions solving those problems and what are the existing gaps. But as we were looking into those type of solutions, we found that many of these solutions are very carbon tunnel focused, meaning that these solutions are very focused on trying to reduce emissions and not really looking into holistic factors like what are its impact on like biodiversity loss, waste management, local communities. And a lot of it has to do with many of these solutions are based off of climate change frameworks that are also carbon tunnel vision, which are we looked into like the drawdown frameworks and the UN SDGs. But overall, with the current goal of our spring 2022 project is to create a climate change framework that analyzes current climate change solutions in a more holistic manner, which I think I can talk a little bit more about. Yeah, so like Kayla mentioned, this semester we were broadening our scope, even though we started with a overconsumption, overproduction lens. We really realized ourselves that a holistic approach is needed, and that's what we wanted to make it easier to think holistically about taking sustainable action. And we really were inspired by SDGs and the drawdown framework, not only because they have a huge influence in terms of guiding decision making about sustainability and equity, but also because they have some kinds of shortcomings that really influenced our work, and that we wanted to kind of build off of them and create better frameworks. So for the drawdown, if anyone is familiar with it, it kind of lists a hierarchy of solutions, but the way they list it is solely based on carbon emissions. So that's one quantitative metric. It's not really taking into other qualitative aspects, which we get into. And then sustainable development goals, they cover a lot of really important topics, equally important, but the nature of it lacks systematic thinking. So focusing on one, you can easily contribute to a false, you can negatively impact another goal. So that was kind of the issues that we were really hoping to address in our framework. Yeah.
So this semester, our team created this framework. So what it does is it takes in an entity of issue and a solution, and then it passes it through our framework, and it questions the solution through various lenses to determine its viability within these different themes. So these are all the themes, and then these are all the criteria. And so if the solution does not pass the criteria, it has to be reworked until it can pass the criteria. To help with this, our framework guides the rework process. And then lastly, we have a badge system, which labels the solution in a color-coded way to represent its holistic success. And as the solution is reworked, the badge can change so it can go up in level. Over the next couple of slides, we'll go into more detail in each section, so I'll pass it on to Natalie.
So for the part one section, which is the solutions critique, we really did a lot of research to broaden our horizons and understand like what kind of material do we need to question in each of these categories to get up the most holistic view. And so while going through like economics and modern capitalism, we also looked at Eastern philosophies and indigenous people's knowledge to make sure that all of our categories have the most holistic criteria set of questions. And we also use professor feedback, especially for these questions, to make sure that all the questions are as effective as possible when considering this holistic mindset.
So the reason we created a rework section, sorry, next slide. So the reason we created a rework section was that we can encourage mindful problem solving when it came to looking at these solutions. So we want to ask, what is the solution overlooking, and how can we address the solution or alter it so that it becomes more holistic? And another reason we did this was we want to encourage a growth mindset, which with each solution that we put through the framework, we want to constantly reassess like how can this solution improve. And this can also help combat greenwashing because we see industries latch on to certain solutions like carbon emissions or bioplastics, and that kind of becomes the baseline and the norm. So we really want to go back and keep asking how can these solutions improve. So if you go on to the next slide, this is our rework section, and this is an example for our overproduction and overconsumption theme. So what we've done is we provided common themes that are generally like overlooked, and then we have created a sub-framework for you to evaluate specific gaps, like is it quality or quantity? That's a specific theme that your solution is lacking on, and we have provided like a general recommendation of how you can meet this criteria. So the third part is the badge system, like Priya introduced, and this is kind of to solidify and give an idea of how your solution is doing. Just on your own, it's a self-evaluation tool, but you can use it to compare to other solutions as well. And hopefully this will incentivize action and push people to improve their solution from wherever it is to get to the green badge. Now I'll pass it on to Geeta.
Yeah, so this semester, we were able to take on quite a number of solutions to not only inform the quality of our questions, but also to take a look at each one of these solutions that we commonly come across and measure it up to in terms of our framework. And each one of these research really informed like the sub-criteria and the language behind our framework.
And so now we're going to walk with you through our framework, looking through different solutions with different entities. One of the solutions that passes this framework is climate education. This solution is unique in the sense that it educates people about different environmental issues, current generations and future generations, hoping that these people who are educated can not make the same environmental mistakes. And so when we put this solution through the framework through the lens of like overconsumption, consciousness, environmental metrics, and relieving impact, it educates people to avoid making mistakes. But as we put this solution through the rework section, one thing to consider is in a sense the category effectiveness, like how can the solution be implemented. So it's definitely a scales issue because it depends on like the capacity to, have like hire volunteers to teach climate education to local communities or mandate companies to, mandate like training on climate education. So when passing through this framework, overall, it does pass the badge system,
but something to consider is the effectiveness, meaning like how can we implement it at a local and global scale. I'll pass it to Angika to talk about zero waste stores.
Yeah, so our next solution is zero waste stores. So the situation we have is that for our daily household items, we rely on single-use and plastic packaged products. This can be for like toothbrush, for your pasta, for anything really. And you see that large corporate chains like Target, Walmart, and Safeway, these are the norms and these are what people have to depend on to get these items. But the solution is suggesting that we switch to local zero waste stores that provide a bulk option or a bring your own container option or a plastic-free option for these items. And so if you go through each criteria, you see that this doesn't, currently the implementations of the zero waste stores are implemented so that it encourages minimalism and reduction overall. And it really encourages quality products over quantity. So it doesn't contribute to overproduction or overconsumption. It brings a new level of mindful buying, and environmentally, there's definitely a decrease in waste and pollution. And with zero waste stores, because they're so local, you also have more transparency in where things are sourced from and how they arrive to the store. So you can ensure that the living beings impact is also met. And overall effectiveness is, we have seen that this is being implemented a lot. So it is a transition that is able to be made. But although it passes, in our rework section, we see that there are a couple of themes to reconsider as more zero waste stores become the norm. So first is greenwashing. Like I said, we want to ensure that minimalism and reduction overall is still a characteristic of the store. We may have like zero waste stores these days having pencil tins or a lot of other different types of products that we're producing, but the main goal is to provide those basic daily household needs at a good, reasonable price. Whereas things like the pencil tins can get a little bit more pricey and kind of more unnecessary, kind of against the use what you have philosophy. So, and then another one is accessibility. So currently they're predominantly in progressive or rich areas, but we want to increase the quantity of these so that each neighborhood has access to them. Price-wise, through articles, we found that it is not more expensive than like a grocery store for what you're buying. It's mainly the accessibility issue. And transparency, like I mentioned, we want to keep this universal for all zero waste stores that pop up. We want them to be as transparent as the ones are now on where they get all of their products from. And another issue is scale. So right now, these are happening at a very local level, very small owners to small ownership. However, we want to make sure that it's keeping this local relationship. That's the best way to ensure quality and transparency is met. However, you can also see that corporate stores are leading towards a new bulk idea, which you see that through Whole Foods or Sprouts. But when they do it, they don't take into account many other things such as reduction and no plastic use. So yeah. Now I'll pass it on to Max.
So consumer production and implementation of solar panels is often looked toward as like a solution for the energy crisis, and that they have a really low carbon footprint. But I think as our framework seems to emphasize, that's not really the whole picture. So solar panels, when you produce in mass, have a couple problems with them. The first is they consume a finite amount of rare and hard to extract materials. They have a limited lifespan from a warranty of 25, but ultimately up to 50 years. And they exploit labor in their production and devastate ecosystems in their extraction. And so for these reasons, they really fail at the overproduction and overconsumption and the living beings impact of our framework. So if solar panels are to be an effective solution, they need significant rework. They need protection for miners and workers who extract and produce the panels. They need to recycle the entire panel, not downcycling or tossing it aside into kind of e-waste. And they need to acknowledge the differential implementation of solar panels along axes of wealth, both between and within communities. Now I'll pass pass off to Emma.
Thank you, Max. So I decided to focus on corporate social responsibility. We all know that private sector intervention is very necessary in combating the climate change crisis. During my research, I found an interview with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. He said when talking about CSR programming that if you don't get something done in Congress, you're not going to get anything done. So looking at this corporate social responsibility solution, what it really is lacking is corporate lobbying. Corporate lobbying is the most impactful tool that corporations have to combat the climate crisis, yet they are not using that powerful tool. For example, in a research study done by InfluenceMap, corporations have financial and political influence within these political arenas, yet in 2020, these 5 tech companies who have the most pro-climate rhetoric, it is Alphabet, Apple, Amazon, Microsoft, and Facebook, spent $65 million in lobbying, but only 6% was used to further climate policy. Corporations are twice as influential than any other corporate lobbying group, and CSR programming through looking at our framework, I found that it is compliant with fossil fuel companies as they are not threatening these high carbon emitters, but rather just being compliant. And we see that big oil outspends all pro-climate organizations by a factor of 10 to 1. So looking at the themes to be considering, CSR programs are encouraging greenwashing. There's a lack of transparency, specifically within ESG reporting. There's no auditing method similar to how financial reporting works, which means that they're only reporting things that make companies look good, which is a huge issue. And there's also no paradigm shift. They're just focusing on solutions that are business as usual, rather than really challenging their business models to be more sustainable. Looking at the badge system, CSR programming is red, but I believe that CSR programming does have, the potential to be super effective. So I think through reworking, making CSR programs, mandatory for all companies to implement, as well as making sure ESG reporting is audited, such as financial reporting is, and finally making sure that CSR programs include lobbying so that the pro-climate rhetoric that companies are reporting on is backed by climate policy action, which is the Sustainable Development Goal number 16 or number 13, which is climate action. This kind of applies to our rework section, so that is why it was deemed a red badge, but it still is not a solution that we should completely toss out into the bucket. I'm going to pass it off to Natalie, who's going to talk about Beyond Meat.
So I chose Beyond Meat specifically because it is one of the biggest corporations that use this plant-based meat, and it is one of them that has the most data on it. Because it is a relatively new invention creation, there isn't a whole lot of data on the impacts of it. So all of the articles that came to this were relatively new, and it's become there's things coming out daily, it seems like, with Beyond Meat specifically. So I gave this solution a 1 out of 5 because it is a prime example of a solution that doesn't consider a holistic aspect for its impact. So yes, it does have less water than beef, which is probably the solution that it's trying to combat and replace in a way. But it uses less water, does have lower carbon emissions, and uses less land than beef. However, there are a lot of problems within its production chain that lead to an overall a worse product in some ways. One of them is that because it is a pea protein product, it uses monocultures to grow those peas, and so that has adverse effects on soil health, as well as lack of biodiversity. There is all of the Beyond patties that you can buy in the store use single-use plastic for their packaging, so then there's a lot of waste per serving. And lastly, there is a lot of, from what I have found, a disjoint between the transparency of the companies versus the actual realities of the health effects of Beyond Meat. And so they're marketed as being healthy and green, but the truth is that even though they have less fat than real meat, they have much more sodium. And so there is that is one example of this disjoint between the transparent these corporations who are using several aspects of their advantages, being the less water, more less carbon emissions, and less land use. But on the downside, there was a lot of problems within the production line. And another bad effect of plant-based meats is Beyond Burgers specifically use palm oil and coconut oil, which are linked to exploitative labor forces as well as a major contributor to deforestation. And so for this solution to become viable, I really think that Beyond Meat specifically needs to check on where, like how their production is being used. So like, again, the palm and the coconut oil, like where are those resources coming from, even though like the patty as a whole is marketed as being green. So that's why I gave this one a 1 out of 5, because again, it is a good example of how one solution that is good in one way can be horrible in many others. So I'll pass it on to Priya.
Thanks. Yeah, so as you can see through all the solutions that are just presented, our framework allows us to look at the solutions in a pretty different way while still providing help for further rework and improvement. Here, the voucher system is translated to a scale, and all these icons represent all the solutions that we looked at as a team over the slides. And I think Kayla's going to say a little more.
Yeah, and so as we were like looking into the solutions that is presented on, you can tell that there are some solutions that pass the framework, but there are some solutions that definitely need reworking that really emphasizes that sustainability it's really necessary for many of the frameworks out there to be in a widening perspective to think more about these solutions holistically. I'll pass it on to Matt. Thank you.
So to review, these are all the solutions that we went through. So the key takeaways, sustainability is primarily an issue of scale that requires a widening of our perspectives. Sustainability issues are also systemic issues. Our strategy and focus to achieving a sustainable future needs to shift and support more holistic solutions. Examples like our framework need to become the norm and not carbon tunnel vision if we are to truly achieve a sustainable future. Moving forward, we hope to develop and refine our criteria. We hope to share our framework with different entities, whether it be local policymakers, nonprofits, private companies, or local communities, as well as host classes and bring our framework to educational workshops on campus. Over the summer, we intend to create an interactive website where we'll have a self-guide through the framework, so any actor, individual, or enterprise can adopt it. Thank you.
Great job, guys. You're a little past 7, but thank you guys for all your coming. Yes, we have a few more slides. Just about so. But thank you so much for coming. Everyone did a really good job. This is
Really quickly, I wanted to tie everything together as like an SUG focused board. I want to talk a little bit about how I think, like Jürgen mentioned, the SDGs are very compartmentalized, think about one at a time. So I wanted to kind of bring them all together, hopefully, but also bring all your reports together. Climate action kind of really focuses on the Redwood project and making sure that we think about how ecology and like our climate is situated, but also how that relates to sustainable communities and thinking about urban agriculture and housing and how that humans are intricately related and dependent upon, and also have like a really strong relationship with that nature and with the climate. And then how that also relates to creating strong institutions like the framework they all created around making sure that how we think of things are equitable and come from a place of consciousness and mindfulness. So wanted to kind of put everything together into a more holistic framework of how even though all these reports seem very separate and are very separate in their own ways, can also come together under the UN SDGs and be in a little cool diagram.
Yes. Okay. So all of this research can be found on our website, including the research that was presented today. Will be uploaded soon. This is our website, surg.berkeley.edu. We made it specifically designed to provide research. So please join us. Please. Thank you everyone for coming. This has been a really wonderful semester. The researchers have done a great job, especially through challenges with COVID. Do you have any other questions about SURG? No? Thank you for coming. SURG researchers, you could say just a little bit after that we put that.